Welcome guys, back to the stream. Today is day 20 already. Oops, we have day 20 already of the stream, and we're continuing with CSS Grid, and hopefully today is more hands-on because the previous stream we had, it was just reading and it was very tiring and boring, at least for me. So we're 78% complete already with the intermediate HTML and CSS, and now we're on to the creating a grid lesson. Perfect. Day 20. Let's go. Now that you know what CSS grid layout is, you will learn how to create your own grid. This lesson will cover making a grid container, adding columns and rows, the explicit and implicit concept behind grid, and how to space out grid gaps. So, lesson overview. This section contains general overview of topics that you will learn in this lesson. We'll make a grid container, define grid tracks, explain the difference between an implicit and explicit grid, set gaps between grid cells. So I don't know how to do most of this stuff, so we'll have probably a lot to learn. Setting up a grid. This lesson will show you how easy it is to make a grid layout without much work. In upcoming lessons you'll find out more about positioning and how to make complex grids, but for now we'll start with something basic. So, grid container. We can think about CSS grid in terms of container and items. When you make an element a grid container, it will contain the whole grid. In CSS, an element is turned into a grid container with the property display grid or display inline grid. So, if you can see, we have a container in the HTML, which is a div that holds 4 divs, and we set the container as display grid. Okay, in this example, the parent element marked class container becomes a grid container, and each of the direct child elements below it automatically become grid items. What's easy about CSS grid is that you don't have to assign each child element a property. Know that only the direct child elements will become grid items here. Sorry, ooh, what is that? Okay, know that if we had another element as a child under one of these child elements, I'm 2 minutes late but still made it. Sup man, Supreme Overworld, what is up my guy? Thank you for joining once again. You're not late at all, that was funny. We're continuing with CSS Grid, and as I said, hopefully today it will be a little bit more hands-on, because last time it was just I hated just reading the whole stream. But yeah, we're finally going to make some grids. Start my Flexbox lessons today. Fuck yeah, Flexbox, I love it, man. You can check out this game. I think it was called, yeah, Flexbox Froggy. So that is back in the day what I used to learn Flexbox. Well, not just that, but it's a great resource still. So here you have to position the frog on top of the leaf. So here they told you here, for example, it's Flexen, so you can just copy it, but you have 24 of those lessons, and it's a fun game to go through. Here, justify content, it will be center, justify content center, and they go onto the center. So you can check it out. Wow, why is that? Wait, maybe I have to restart my browser capture because it is not updating. Screen capture. Some update popped up, and now the screen is frozen. Let me try again. You didn't see any of it. Alright, so that should be better. But yeah, this is the game. It's called Flexbox Froggy, and it's just a fun game to learn Flexbox. I like it a lot. Justify content. What is it? Space between. Yep, no space around. So you can go through it. I'm not going to spoil any more of the solutions, but yeah, it's pretty fun. I'm pumped for you, man. Let's go. Okay. So we've read through this. Only the direct children get to be grid items. But as you learned in the Flexbox lessons, grid items can also be grid containers. So you could make grids inside of grids if you wanted. Lines and tracks in grids. Oh my. Since you're coding along with our example, right, you will notice that it doesn't look very gridish yet. So I'm not coding along with the example. Yeah, no spoilers. No worries, man. It's pretty interesting to go through it. And you go through it pretty fast, but yeah, it's a good resource. A lot of resources on CSS Grid, like how to show you boxes, and outline grid tables right from the start. But if your grid container and grid items don't have any borders, you won't actually be able to see the lines on the page, so don't worry, they're still there. If you inspect these elements on a web page using developer tools, you'll notice grid badges on the grid elements in the code. The layout options of the dev tools allow you to select an overlay that can show these invisible lines, tracks and areas of the grid. You read about using browser's developer tools in the assignment below and learn more about lines, tracks and areas in the next lesson. Columns and rows. Now that we have our grid container with several grid items all set up, it's time to specify our columns and rows. This will define the grid track, the space between lines on a grid. So we could set a column track to give us space between our columns and a row track to give us space between our rows. Okay, we'll get into the specifics of tracks and lines in the next lesson, but now let's just make some columns and rows. So we have grid template columns and grid template rows to make the columns and rows. Make defining column and row tracks easy. For this lesson we'll stick to defining our columns and rows using pixels. In the upcoming lessons you'll learn more about defining with percentages and fractional units too. Going back to our grid container from above, let's define 2 columns and 2 rows to place our 4 grid items. So as you can see in the beginning, it didn't really make a difference that we set the display to grid. The structure is pretty much the same as it was, but when we start defining columns and rows, they start taking that grid structure. So we want to add more columns and rows to our grid. We can define these values to make another track. Let's say we want to add a 3rd column to our example. So here they just have two columns, 2 rows, each one 50 pixels, and they just add another 50 pixels to make a you can actually type in here, I messed the example up, but they just type another 50 pixels to make another column, unless you have 2 rows. I'm wondering if you have more items here. So the 5th one, for example, will take this 2nd place in the 2nd row, but if we have a 6th and a 7th, where is the 7th one going to go? I generally don't know. Yeah, of course. Okay, so that's kind of strange though, because we're setting up 2 rows, but now we have a 3rd one. What if we add more? Alright, so we indeed have 2 rows, and from then on it doesn't follow the grid structure. Right. If we say dot div and then do we actually don't need the dot, but just div outline 1 pixel solid black. Here you can see the divs with an outline, but yeah. CSS Grid also includes a shorthand property for defining rows and columns. In our previous example, we can replace the properties for grid template rows and grid template columns with the shorthand grid template property. Here we can define our rows and columns all at once. For this property, rows are defined before the slash and columns are defined after the slash. Let's keep the same column and row values, but using the shorthand property instead. So I think this is pretty cool. Even probably if you're you can add like a variable with the number of rows and columns, but this is just a lot more clean. You just have to remember which ones are the columns and which ones are the rows and do it all in one line. Perfect. So grid template. Columns and rows don't have to share all the same values either. Let's change the property values of our column so that the first column is 5 times as wide as the others. So first one is 250 pixels and the next one are 50 pixels each, so that doesn't matter. You can make them as big or small as you want. Explicit versus implicit grid. Let's go back to our original example of a 2x2 layout for our grid items. What happens if you add a fifth items to a container without changing our grid template columns or grid template rows property? So this is exactly what I did a bit up top, where I added more items. Seems like this is part of the explicit versus implicit grid. You will notice that the fifth item was placed on the grid and is being spotted into a new third row, not new, that we did not define. This is because of the implicit grid concept and how CSS Grid is able to automatically place grid items when we haven't explicitly defined the layout for them. We'll use grid template columns and grid. When we use grid template columns and rows properties, we're explicitly defining grid tracks to lay out our grid items. But when the grid needs more tracks or extra content, it will implicitly define new grid tracks. Additionally, the size values established from our columns and rows properties are not carried over to these new implicit grid tracks, but we can define values for the implicit grid tracks. So that's pretty cool. In case we have more data to display than we originally thought, we can define how it's going to be handled with grid auto rows and auto columns, as it seems. But let's see. We can set the implicit grid track size using the grid auto rows and grid auto columns properties. In this way, we can ensure any new tracks the implicit grid makes for extra content are set at values that we defined. Let's say we want any new rows to stay in the same value as our explicit row track sizes. They will do grid auto rows as 50 pixels as are the original grid template rows. Perfect. By default, CSS Grid will add additional content with implicit rows. This means the extra elements would keep being added further down the grid in a vertical fashion. It would be much less common to want extra content added horizontally along the grid, but that can be set using the grid auto flow to column. So this like a flex direction column, but it's grid auto flow column. Alright. and implicit track sizes can be identified with grid auto columns property. Alright, perfect. So next we have the gap. The gap between grid rows and columns is known as the gutter or alley. Gap sizes can be adjusted separately for rows and columns using the column gap and row gap properties. Furthermore, we can use a shorthand property called gap to set both row gap and column gap. Before adding our grid gap properties, let's make things a little easier to see without relying on developer tools. We'll go ahead and add a border around our grid items so you can get a better sense of their placement around each other. So what they did is inside the container, every div they set a border of 1 pixel solid blue. Next, you use a slide grid column gap to space out our two columns a bit. So they do column gap, not gap, but column gap of 10 pixels, and that will put a 10 pixel gap between the columns. Row gap of 100 pixels, pretty self-explanatory, and I guess if you just remove these two and just say gap of 10 pixels, it will do it both for the columns and the rows, and it will be symmetrical. You can also try playing with the shorthand gap, but can you set different? Yeah. So the first one will be for the rows and second one for the columns, as like setting the grid templates. The first value will be the gap between the rows and the second between the columns, as you can see. Alright, wrapping up our first grid. Now that you've made a grid, you can start to see how easy it is to control the layout of your elements with CSS Grid. You may also realize how CSS Grid can solve common layout problems. In the next couple of lessons, we'll cover positioning elements and advanced grid attributes, but first check out the links below that cover making the basics of a grid in more detail. So read parts 1, 2 and 3 from CSS Grid Complete Guide to Grid. Watch this short video on implicit versus explicit tracks from Wes Bos. Okay, and look through the developer tools docs on inspecting CSS grids in Chrome. We have knowledge check and the additional resources as well, MDN, short video on grid terminology. Alright, so where are parts 1, 2 and 3 are those? Read parts 1, 2 and 3. So introduction, basics and important terminology, is that it? I guess so. Introduction, CSS Grid, grid basics and terminology. Alright, so they just want those 3 parts. That's interesting. Grid animation, yeah, I guess they just want the why don't they want me to read the grid properties? I'm not sure, but whatever they say. So I'll close this out and we can quickly go through the introduction, basics and grid terminology. Alright, so CSS Grid Layout, aka Grid or CSS Grid, is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system that compared to any web layout system of the past completely changes the way we design user interfaces. CSS has always been used to lay out our web pages, but it's never done a very good job of it. First, we use tables, then folds, positioning and inline block. But all of these methods were essentially hacks and left out a lot of important functionality, like vertical centering, for example. Flexbox is also a very great layout tool, but its one-directional flow has different use cases, and they actually work together quite well. CSS is the very first CSS module created specifically to solve the problems we've all been hacking our way around for as long as we've been making websites. The intention of this guide is to present the grid concepts as they exist in the latest version of the specification, so I won't be covering out-of-date Internet Explorer syntax, even though you can absolutely use grid in Internet Explorer 11 or other historical hacks. Alright, CSS Grid Basics. So as of March 2017, most browsers ship native unprefixed support for CSS Grid. Chrome, including Android, Firefox, Safari, including iOS, and Opera, Internet Explorer 10 and 11, on the other hand, supported, but it's an old implementation with an outdated syntax. The time to build with grid is now. So to get started, you have to define a container element as grid with display grid, set the column and row sizes with grid template columns and grid template rows, and then place its child elements into the grid with grid column and grid row. Place its child elements into the grid. So let me check this out. Grid column, start line, end line, and this is in CSS. Alright, wow, we'll check this out. Similarly to Flexbox, the source order of the grid items doesn't matter. Your CSS can place them in any order, which makes it super easy to rearrange your grid with media queries. Imagine defining the layout of your entire page and then completely rearranging it to accommodate a different screen width, all with only a couple of lines of CSS. Grid is one of the most powerful CSS modules ever introduced. Okay. Next we have important CSS Grid terminology, which is also the third and last part of this article, at least for us. Before diving into the concept of grid, it's important to understand the terminology, since the terms involved here are all kind of conceptually similar. It's easy to confuse them with one another if you don't first memorize their meanings defined by the grid specification. But don't worry, there aren't many of them. So grid container, the element on which display grid is applied, is a direct parent of all grid items. In this example, container is the grid container. Grid item, the children, an example, direct descendants of the grid container. Here the item elements are grid items, but sub item isn't. So these divs with the class of items are grid items, but this p tag sub item isn't a grid item. Okay. Grid line, the dividing lines that make up the structure of the grid. They can be either vertical column grid lines or horizontal row grid lines and reside on either side of a row or column. Here the yellow line is an example of a column grid line. Grid cell, the space between two adjacent row and two adjacent column grid lines. It's a single unit of the grid. Here is the grid cell between row grid lines 1 and 2 and column, so row grid lines, so this is the one, this is the first one, this is the second one, and column grid lines 2 and 3, so 1, 2 and 3. Grid track, the space between two adjacent grid lines. You can think of them as the columns are rows of the grid. Here's the grid track between the second and third row grid lines. So between the second and third, this is an entire row track. Grid area, the total space surrounded by 4 grid lines. A grid area may be composed of any number of grid cells. Here is the grid area between row grid lines 1 and 3 and column grid lines 1 and 3. Alright, so this was it. Pretty interesting and useful. And now we have a video to watch by Wes Bos, which is 6 minutes long, so let's dive into it. Let me see if this sounds so right. I think a little bit louder.
CSS Grid, and it's something that's going to keep coming up. So let's make sure that we absolutely nail this before we move on. And that is understanding the implicit grid, implicit tracks, and explicit tracks, and the explicit grid, and how we can sort of use them together in order to make a really flexible and fluid looking website. So open up O5 and the starter file that we have there. I've got 4 items here and I've displayed grid it. Let's go ahead and turn on our dev tools here so we can see how it's looking. And I'm gonna make my tracks black. Good. Now let's go ahead and make sort of a 2x2 grid that we have there. First we'll put some gap on there, 20px, good. And then we'll add some columns. And let's do 200 pixels and 400 pixels. Now we've got a grid with 2 columns in it, and then we have 2 rows. So this is the difference between the explicit and the implicit. I have explicitly defined what the columns will be, and then I have not defined what the rows will be. So those are what are called implicit. So if you do not create them, they are called implicit, meaning that the browser says, oh, okay, well, you've made 2 columns. Great, I can put 1 and 2 there, but now I've got these extra elements left. What do I do with them, right? Like, you can't just throw them out. They need to go somewhere. So what it will do is it says, okay, well, I have no more columns to put them in, so I might as well start to wrap onto the second line, and that will then create a row. So even though we did not define any rows here, they have been implicitly created. So if we then zoom in to see everything that we have, you'll see that the solid line means that that is where our explicit grid has been started. And then the dotted lines means that is where the explicit columns have been created. And then the dotted horizontal lines are a little bit lighter, and that means that they are implicitly created. Watch how that changes if we just, let's dupe this over and change it over to rows as well. And now you'll notice that if we zoom in, first of all, they are much bigger because we have defined what the sizes of those rows will be. But now if we zoom in, you'll notice that the horizontal lines that we have in DevTools here are now solid and dashed and not opaque and dotted. And that is because we have explicitly defined what they will look like. If we scroll down here, you'll see also we have a solid line, and that means that is where the explicit grid ends. So solid line is where the explicit grid starts and stops. So you can see that it's the column starts here and the columns end here, and then up here the columns start here, or sorry, the rows start here and the rows end here. So this is 100% explicit. Let's make these a little bit smaller in terms of rows. So maybe we'll do 50px and 100. Now, here's the big question. What happens if I now add a 5th and a 6th item to this? Whoa, what just happened there? Well, we only told it that we want 2 columns, which is fine. So 1, 2. But then we only sized 2 of the rows. However, we have 6 items. So what's happening is that CSS Grid is going to say, well, okay, I'm done with the explicit grid. See how the solid line ends right here, but I've got extra items. So it's going to then create a new.
It's cool, the visualization in Chrome, how they did it with the dashed and dotted lines, and where the solid line ends, the grid ends. So as he said, here the explicit grid rows ends as this thick black line, and from then on it's just dotted lines where the implicit grid is. So I very much like how much detail they put in Chrome, and I never knew that before using it. I didn't know that.
Row for us, and that is referred to as a what? An implicit row. Good. So we've gone over these. We've got our gap, we've got our grid template columns, and our grid template rows. We've done those a bunch of times. Now the question is, how do I size these implicitly created ones, right? We can go ahead and size the values for the explicit ones, no problem. But the implicit ones will look a little bit something like this. So we say grid auto rows, and the grid auto rows will define how big the rows are for when they have been added. So if I were to then add, let's do something ridiculous like 500 px. Now you'll see that any extra implicitly created rows are now going to be 500 pixels high. So if I were to dupe these over into 7 and 8, you'll see that 5, 6, 7, 8, all of those implicitly created rows are going to be 500 pixels high. You might be thinking, okay, well, could I do something like this? 100 px, 500 px. And if we go and inspect it, you go on 5 and 6. Let's look at the rules here. Let's look at our container. You'll notice that it's actually crossed out, and that's actually currently an open issue at the time of recording in Firefox. Is that in Firefox you are not able to define the size of multiple implicit rows. And if we were to open that up in Chrome, you'll see that it actually does work. So you should be able to do it. It should be fixed fairly soon. But at the time of recording, you're only able to pass one value for the implicit rows. Okay, we also have grid auto columns. And let's say that would be 100 px and give that a save. Now that didn't do anything. And that's like, how do you get extra columns? So by default, what will happen is you define your columns, and then any extra elements will automatically be turned.
What was it? Grid auto column or grid auto flow column?
Into rows. But that's where the next video comes in. We're going to be...
Hello there, what are you working on? Hi there, Alan, thank you for tuning into my stream. Currently we're going through the Odin project on CSS Grid, and we have a project at the end of the lectures, but yeah, we're just going through the Odin project and learning about CSS Grid for now.
Talking about something called grid auto flow, and that is instead of automatically giving us rows, we're going to automatically give us more columns. So I'll see you in the next video.
Alright, sure. So this was a pretty interesting one. There you can see people from the Odin project. Next up we have inspect CSS Grid layouts. There also is a video, so before I remove my headset, we're going to watch this one. Supreme Overload says, oh yeah, I almost forgot to tell you, I checked your GitHub, but the rock paper scissors game was not showing on my browser. Yeah, cool. I don't know what's up with that 3D RPS. Maybe use this link 3drps.netlify.app. I don't know where you opened it, but I think in GitHub I've also added this link. Let me just check. So live link here. I'm not sure. What browser are you using? This in Chrome. Could be something with the browser indeed. But also it should work on mobile as well. I'm not sure. Let's check this video before. Yeah, that link works. Cool, cool. We did that on stream. It was one of the first days that we did that game. It took a couple of days actually, but yeah, we did it on stream.
In this episode, I would like to talk about debugging CSS Grid with DevTools.
Alright.
In my previous video, we talked about debugging CSS Flexbox. Grid debugging tools are similar, but with more details in it. Let's say you have a grid container defined and want to create a layout like this, with a fixed height header, a slim sidebar, and a big content area. Let's start with enabling the grid badge next to the container. This way, you can visualize the grid layout better on the page itself. Another thing I would do here is extending the grid lines in the layout pane. I find the extended lines very helpful to inspect the grid alignment. Let's define the grid structure. We will have two rows with 100 pixels and 1 FR each. 1 FR means a fractional unit of the available space. Next, we define two columns with 1 FR and 2 FR each. The section placement is not quite right now. Let's fix that with the help of the line numbers on screen. The line numbers on the side are the row numbers. We can refer to a particular row with either numbers.
So there are where the row starts, I guess, because this is row 1, this is row 2, but you have you can't see it from here, but you have a third row, but we haven't defined that, I don't think. Hello, Edhos Saju, sorry if I butchered your name, brother. I'm planning to make web app. How to set up my project in Firebase? I have no idea. I'm also interested in learning about Firebase,
For
but
example,
at the moment I don't know, brother. I cannot help you.
we can place the header
Watch
in row
tutorial on YouTube. I'm pretty sure there are plenty.
1,
You'll be fine.
or we can refer to it as row -3 as well. We also want to span the header
Also, what web app are you trying to make? Tell us. I'm interested to know.
across the whole line. The top and bottom line numbers refer to the columns. In our case, we want to span the column
Thank you so much, brother. Thank you.
through line 1 to line 3. -3 to -1 works too.
Alright, so that's interesting. I don't know how she did that. She places the header in grid row -3 and grid column from -3. So she places grid row -3, which I don't see where -3 is, but grid column between -3 and -1.
Now our layout is looking good.
Huh.
The declaration just now
We'll learn how to do it, don't worry.
is fine. But in some cases, you might label your line instead of using line numbers because numbers can be confusing sometimes, especially if you have a lot of grid items. DevTools can help you with that. Here, I will label the column lines as start, middle,
We don't see where she's typing.
and end. In the layout pane, I can choose to show line names instead of numbers. Then, in the header, I can adjust the column to span from start to end instead of using the number. Isn't that nice?
That is very cool,
Apart
from
from
start
that,
to end.
Some people might label the grid by area instead of line. You can use DevTools to visualize that as well. In the grid, we can label the grid template areas by top and side main. Then, in the layout pane, we can enable the show area name settings. With the area name shown on the screen, it is easier for us to work with our grid items. In the header, we can disable the row and column styles and replace it with grid area top instead. Another nice debugging settings is to show the track sizes of the grid. In the layout pane,
Wait, so you're trying to make a chat app for your college when you can chat with people in real time? That is so cool, my man. I think there is also such project in the Odin project that we're going to go through, but that's very interesting. And what are you using to write it? What's your tech stack, your language, and so on?
enable the show track sizes option. The size labels are added to the overlay. The labels not only show the sizes we define in the styles pane, but the actual size as well. The labels are updated in real time as we change the grid size. The last feature I want to mention here is the grid editor. It can help us to adjust the grid layout without memorizing the syntax. Say we want to align our grid items to center, you can click on the grid editor button in the styles pane, then select align item center and justify item center to center the items. I like this editor because it shows me a nice overview of all the options visually. Alright, to learn more about grid in general, go to this web.
Plain HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that's really cool. Alright, perfect. You can make, I guess, are you using Node.js or I'm just not sure how you make it real time with just JavaScript. Is there like Node.js in that, or?
dev link on the screen. And to learn more about debugging grid with DevTools, go to goo.go/devtools-grid.
I like this view, but to be honest, I didn't understand much of it, probably because I haven't
That's all.
written any grid. So what I'm going to do is save it to watch for later here, and later on I can check it out again. But let's see what they have here in terms of reading. I'm going to move this a little bit closer. Discover CSS grids. When an HTML element on your page has display grid or display inline grid applied to it, you can see a grid badge next to the elements panel. And when you click on it, I guess, click on the badge to toggle the display of a grid. The display of a grid overlay on the page. The overlay appears over the element laid out like a grid to show the position of its grid lines and tracks. Open the layout page. When the grids are included on a page, the layout pane includes grid section containing a number of options for viewing those grids. So I'm curious if they did it that way, and it will be really cool if they actually made this page using grid. Yeah, they did. So when you click on it, you can start seeing those lines. And let's see what else we can do. They go over to the layout. Maybe I should put it my sidebar on the right side. Wait. Yeah. So they go into the layout, show track sizes, show area names, extend grid lines. Maybe if we go into it, there are other flex grid items. Now I see flex. Yeah. This one, the main one, is grid, but I cannot exactly see the area names or the things that they tell us in here. Align grid items and their content with the grid editor. You can align grid items and their content with a click of a button instead of typing CSS rules. To align items and their content, use elements styles pane and click the grid editor button next to display grid. So if we click on the main, we should somewhere see display grid. There you go. And then we can play with those, justify items, so on and so forth. Nothing really happens, but the cool thing is that they add the CSS for you. So if you see it, if I click here, for example, justify item start, this thing will change, and start, center, so on. So it will actually, instead of only visually showing you, it will give you the code as well, so you can write it in the text editor. Alright, grid viewing options. The grid selection in the layout pane shows two subsections: overlay display settings, grid overlays. So overlay display settings consists of two parts: drop down menu with the following list of options. So wait, you go on to grid and then layout elements, grid and then layout. So it has grid display settings indeed, with the drop down, and you also have the checkboxes here for grid overlays, I guess. Hide line labels, show line numbers, show line names, and the checkboxes options within, show track lines. They're talking about these ones, not the grid overlays. Show track sizes, toggle to show or hide track sizes, show area names, toggle to show or hide area names in the case of grids with named grid areas. Extend grid lines. By default, grid lines are only shown inside the element with display grid or display inline grid set on it. When toggling on this option, the grid line extends to the edge of the viewport along each axis. Let's examine these settings in more detail. Show line numbers. By default, the positive and negative line numbers are displayed on the grid layout overlay. So we saw where that is. I'm going to close it for now and just continue reading through the article. So what they're doing, show line numbers. So it will show you the line numbers of the grid. Pretty straightforward. Hide line labels. Hide line labels to hide the line numbers. So this will show you. So this first option will show you the line numbers, and hide line labels will hide them. Show line names. You can select show line names to view the line names instead of numbers. In this example, we have 4 lines with names left, middle 1, middle 2, and right. In this demo, the orange element spans from left to right with CSS grid column left, right. So from the left is taking that line name left and right. I'm not showing. I see. I was just going to say I'm not sure if you name them or it's done automatically, but as you can see, they do it with grid template columns, and when they define the columns, they also give them a name in brackets. So left is 1 fractional unit, middle 1, middle 2 is 1 fractional unit, and then right is just the end of it, I guess. So they have 3 columns, but they are naming each line. Alright. Show track sizes. Enable show track sizes checkbox to view the track sizes of the grid. DevTools will display authored size minus computed size in each line label. Authorized size, the site defined in the style sheet, omitted if not defined. Computed size, the actual size of the section. In this demo, the snag box column sizes are defined in the CSS Grid template columns as 1 fractional unit and 2 fractional units. Therefore, the column line labels show both the authored and the computed sizes, 1 fractional unit minus 96.66 pixels and so on. So this is the fractional unit is the one you set in here, and the actual unit is shown in pixels, I guess, how it appears on the screen. And when we watched the video, they were updating it in real time. So when you narrow down the viewport, for example, those numbers will go down. The row line labels show only computed sizes 80 pixels and 80 pixels, since there are no row sizes defined in style sheet. Show area names. To view the area names, enable show area names checkbox. In this example, there are 3 areas in the grid: top, bottom 1 and bottom 2. Also here I can see grid template areas: top, bottom 1, bottom 2. So these are for the 2 columns above, top and top, so they will inhabit the same name. I'm curious if you can just write top once and that's it, but yeah, I'm not sure. And for the bottom ones, they say bottom 1 and bottom 2. extend grid lines. Enable the extend grid lines checkbox to extend the grid lines to the edge of the viewport. Alright, we know about that. Grid overlay section contains a list of grids that are present on the page, each with a checkbox along with various options. Enable overlay views of multiple grids. You can enable overlay views of multiple grids. In this example, there are two grid overlays enabled, main and div snack box, each represented with different colors. Alright, grid template columns. I don't quite get this one, to be completely honest with you, but we'll move forward. Customize the grid overlay color. You can customize each grid overlay color by clicking the color picker. Where is the color picker? I don't see it. Color picker. Anyways, click the highlight icon to immediately highlight the HTML element. Scroll to it in the page and select it in the elements panel. So I guess if you click on here, you can select the whole grid. And that was it from this article. Now we have our favorite MDN. That's again long just a very long article. Anyways, I'm going to remove all these distractions here, so we just have the text and we can read it. But before that, I have to take a quick break, so I'm taking a 10 minutes break and I'll be right back. We'll read through this article, watch through this short video, and we can be done with this lesson. So starting the timer, and I'll be right back with you guys. Gotta go, man, but I'll be around every now and then. I'm learning to become full stack as well, so let's keep pushing. Thank you so much, A1. Thank you for sticking out, man, and I wish you all the best in your journey. Hopefully I see you soon, brother, and we're definitely going to keep it pushing. Thank you, my brother. So as I said, I'll take a quick break, guys, 10 minutes, and I'll be right back and we'll continue. Thank you. Alright boys, I'm back and done with the rest, so now we can start hacking at this MDN article, which probably is going to take a while, but hopefully we learn some new things and solidify our knowledge in CSS Grid. It's quite a long one, but let's see. I have no water unfortunately, but we'll manage it. So CSS Grid Layout introduces a two-dimensional grid system to CSS. Grids can be used to lay out major page areas or small user interface elements. This article introduces the CSS Grid Layout and the new terminology that is part of the CSS Grid Layout Level 1 specification. The features shown in this overview will then be explained in greater detail in the rest of this guide. So, what is a grid? A grid is a set of intersecting horizontal and vertical lines defining columns and rows. Elements can be placed onto the grid within these columns and row lines. CSS Grid Layout has the following features. So fixed and flexible track sizes. You can create a grid with fixed track sizes using pixels, for example. This sets the grid to the specified pixel which fits to the layout you desire. You can also create a grid using flexible sizes with percentages or with the fraction unit designed for this purpose. Item placement. You can place items into a precise location on the grid using line numbers, names, or by targeting an area of the grid. Grid also contains an algorithm to control the placement of items not given an explicit position on the grid. So this is the implicit grid that we know. Creation of additional tracks to hold content. You can define an explicit grid with grid layout. The grid layout specification is flexible enough to add additional rows and columns when needed. Features such as adding as many columns that will fit into a container are included. Alignment control. Grid contains alignment features so you can control how the items align once placed into the grid area and how the entire grid is aligned. Control for overlapping content. More than one item can be placed into a grid cell or area and then they can partially overlap each other. This layering may then be controlled with the z-index property. Grid is a powerful specification that, when combined with other parts of CSS such as Flexbox, can help you create layouts that were previously impossible to build in CSS. It all starts by creating a grid in your grid container. So a grid container, we create a grid container by declaring display grid or display inline grid on an element. As soon as we do this, all direct children of that element become grid items. I'm just going to take a minute to use nasal spray because my nose is stuffed once again and I cannot read, so I'll be right back. Alright, I'm back. Sorry for that. Anyways, in this example we have a containing div with a class of wrapper and inside we have 5 child elements. So The wrapper will be the grid container with display grid, and all the direct children are now grid items. In a web browser you won't see any difference to how these items are displayed before turning them into a grid, as Grid has created a single column grid for these items. At this point you may find it useful to work with the grid inspector available as part of Firefox developer tools. If you view this example in Firefox and inspect the grid, you see a small icon next to the value grid. Click on it and then the grid on this element will be overlaid in the browser window. So if we inspect it and go into here, yeah, we cannot, maybe it's this one. Alright, so yeah, we have grid here, and we have one column that's 420 pixels, nice, and 4 rows that reach 54 pixels, but I think those are implicit because we haven't started defining the sizes yet. But here we can better see show track sizes, show area names, we don't have that, show line numbers, height, show line names we don't have, so show line numbers we have that. Yep, perfect. What else? You won't see any grid inspector, so we've gone through this. As you learn and then work with CSS Grid layout, this tool will give you a better idea of what's happening with your grids visually. If you want to start making this more grid-like, we need to add column tracks. So grid tracks, we define rows and columns on our grid with the grid template rows and grid template columns properties. These define grid tracks. A grid track is the space between any two adjacent lines on the grid. The image below shows a highlighted track. This is the first row track in our grid. Grid tracks are defined in the explicit grid by using the grid template columns and grid template rows properties, or the shorthand grid or grid template properties. Tracks are also created in the implicit grid by positioning a grid item outside of the tracks created in the explicit grid. Okay, have a basic example. I can add to our earlier example by adding the grid template columns property, then defining the size of the column tracks. I have now created a grid with 3 200 pixel wide column tracks. The child items will be laid out on this grid, one in each grid cell. Okay, wrapper grid, grid template column, so we have 3 columns and the rows are implicitly defined. Okay, the FR unit or the fraction unit, so tracks can be defined using any length unit. Grid also introduces an additional length unit to help us create flexible grid tracks. The new FR unit represents a fraction of the available space in the grid container. The next grid definition would create 3 equal width tracks that grow and shrink according to the available space. So I think this unit is pretty cool and should be part of CSS in general, not only used when we have grids. I think it's a very cool unit. Alright, so because the template columns are 1 FR each, they will divide up the space by 3, so this is equal to saying 33%. Unequal sizes. In the next example, we create a definition with a 2 FR track, then 2 1 FR tracks. The available space is split into 4. The 2 parts are given to the first track and 1 part each to the next 2 tracks. Okay, so this is how it's going to look. So the first one will take twice as much space as the second and the last track. Yeah, okay, so mixing flexible and absolute sizes. In this final example, we'll mix absolute size tracks with FR units. The first track is 500 pixels, so the fixed width is taken away from the available space. The remaining space is divided into 3 and assigned in proportion to the 2 flexible tracks. So as you can see, it actually overflows out of the container, which is strange because I thought, since this is 500 pixel, we already have space for it, right? But this is the available space, and 1 FR and 2 FR should take each like 1 fraction of the available space and then 2 fractions of the available space, but then it's actually overlapping out of it, so I don't really understand of that. By my logic, this one should be like cut right here, 3/4 of it should be cut out, and then the rest should be filled by the other item, but anyways, not sure why is that. Track listings with repeat notation. Oh my day. I'm a dumbass. Thank you so much, my brother. Wow, I have no words. I've been reading through the whole time. I don't know when did I mute it, but fucking thank you, man. That was stupid. I thought I was being heard the whole time, but yeah, doesn't seem like it. Anyways, I'll just continue onwards. Thank you so much, Supreme Overlord. That was fucking silly. Alright, wow. Repeat notation takes the track listing and use it to create a repeating pattern of tracks. In this next example, my grid will consist of 10 tracks, a 1 FR track and then followed by a 2 FR track. This pattern will be repeated 5 times. So you make, what is that, 5? Oh, repeat 5 times 1 FR, 2 FR, so it just happened when you go to the repeating. Alright, so it's not too bad. I was just saying that the repeat function is pretty cool and useful. But I have to read this one more time. Repeat notation takes the track listing and then use it to create a repeating pattern of tracks. In this example, my grid will consist of 10 tracks, a 1 FR track and then followed by a 2 FR track. This pattern will repeat 5 times. So you have 1 fraction, 2 fractions, 1 fraction, 2 fractions, and this will be repeated in total 10 times. Or you have 10 columns, but it will be repeated 5 times. Alright, perfect. Implicit versus explicit grids once again. So when creating our example grid, we specifically defined our column tracks with the grid template columns property, but the grid also created rows on its own. These rows are part of the implicit grid, whereas the explicit grid contains any rows and columns defined with the grid template columns and rows. If you place something outside of the defined grid, or due to the amount of content more grid tracks are needed, then the grid creates rows and columns in the implicit grid. These tracks will be auto-sized by default, resulting in their size being based on the content that is inside of them. You can also define a set size for tracks created in the implicit grid with the grid auto rows and auto column properties. In the below example, we use grid auto rows to ensure that tracks created on the implicit grid are 200 pixels tall. Alright, next, track sizing and min-max. When setting up an explicit grid or defining the sizing for automatically created rows or columns, we may want to give tracks a minimum size, but also ensure that they could expand to fit any content that is added. For example, I may want my rows to never go up smaller than 100 pixels, but if my content stretches to 300 pixels height, then I would like the row to stretch to that height. But if my content stretches, yeah. Grid has a solution with this with the min-max function. In this next example, I'm using min-max in the value of grid auto rows. This means automatically created rows will be a minimum of 100 pixels tall and maximum of auto. Using auto means that the size will look at the content size and will stretch to give space for the tallest item in a cell in this row. Okay, pretty straightforward, also pretty cool and useful. Next we have grid lines. It should be noted that when we define a grid, we define the grid tracks, not the lines. Grid then gives us numbered lines to use when positioning items. In our 3-column 2-row grid, we have 4 column lines, so we have the 4th one as well, and here we have the 3rd one when there are in fact only 3 columns and 2 rows. This 4th one is the line. Lines are numbered according to the writing mode of the document in a left to right language. The line 1 is on the left hand side of the grid, and right to left language is on the right hand side of the grid. Lines can also be named, and we'll look at how to do this in a later guide in this series. Positioning items against lines. We'll be exploring line-based placement in full detail in a later article. The following example demonstrates doing this in a simple way. When placing an item, we target the line rather than the track. In the following example, I am placing the first 2 items on our 3-column track grid using the grid column start, grid column end, and grid row start and grid row end properties. Working from left to right, the first item is placed against column line 1 and spans to column line 4, which in our case is the far right line on the grid. It begins at row line 1 and ends at row line 3 before spanning 2 row tracks. Okay. The second item starts on grid column 1 and spans 1 track. This is the default, so I don't need to specify the end line. It also spans 2 row tracks from row line 3 to row line 5. The other items will place themselves into empty spaces on the grid. So they're doing this on the class of the grid item, and here they're defining the positioning. So grid column start will start on line 1 of the columns and end on the grid column 4, so it will span throughout the whole length of the columns. And grid row start is 1, grid row end is 3, so it will take 1, the imaginary 2 is here, and it will go on to the 3. This is not the right example, but here they're showing it, and so on. So that's good. Next we have line positioning shorthand. So as you can see, there is also a shorthand for this, which is good. The one-hand values used above can be compressed onto one line for columns with grid column and one line for rows with grid row. The following example would give the same positioning as in the previous code, but with far less CSS. The value before the / character is the start line, the value after is the end line. You can omit the end value if the area only spans one track. So as I say here, grid column 1, and it will only take up one track. Perfect. So grid cells. A grid cell is the smallest unit on a grid. Conceptually, it's like a table cell, as we saw in our earlier examples. Once a grid is defined as a parent, the child items will lay themselves out on one cell each of the defined grid. In the below image, I have highlighted the first cell of the grid. So indeed, this is the first cell. As you can see, it's a little bit more darker. Grid areas. Items can span one or more cells, both by row or by column, and this creates a grid area. Grid areas must be rectangular. It is possible to create an L-shaped area, for example. It is not possible, sorry. The highlighted grid area spans 2 row and 2 column tracks. Gutters or alleys are between grid cells and can be created using the column gap and row gap properties, or the shorthand of gap. In the below example, I am creating a 10 pixel gap between columns and one EM gap between rows. So we already know about that. Note, when grid first shipped in browsers, the column gap and row gap and gap were prefixed with the grid prefix as grid column gap and grid row gap and grid gap respectively. Browsers all now support unprefixed values. However, the prefix versions will be maintained as aliases, making them safe to use. So you can still use these order naming conventions, but the new ones are just shorter. Any space used by gaps will be accounted for before space is assigned to the flexible length FR tracks. So any space used by gaps will be accounted for. So if you have an FR unit, it will not count the gap. So the gap is like excluded for the available space already. However, you cannot place anything into a gap. In terms of line-based positioning, the gap acts like a thick line. So I was wondering before that, if you have a gap, do you have like 2 lines of each side of the gap, or the gap is a thick line? So it seems like it's a thick line. Nesting grids. A grid item can become a grid container. In the following example, I have 3 column grid that I created earlier with 2 positioned items. In this case, the first item has some sub items. As these items are not direct children of the grid, they do not participate in grid layout and so display a normal document flow. Nesting without subgrid. If I set box 1 to display grid, I can give it a track definition and it too will become a grid. The items lay out on this new grid. So they're giving us the code, but they're just basically setting the items we have inside of the box 1 to grid, or actually setting box 1 to grid, and then you can manipulate those children as grid items as well and create a new grid inside of a grid. Those are a lot of grids. Anyways, In this case, the nested grid has no relationship to the parent. As you can see in the example, it has not inherited the gap of the parent, and the lines in the nested grid do not align to the lines in the parent grid. Subgrid. In addition to a regular grid, subgrid lets you create nested grids that use the track definition of the parent grid. To use them, we edit the above nested grid example to change the track definition of grid template columns of repeat 3x1 FR to grid template columns subgrid. The nested grid then uses the parent grid tracks to lay out items. So this is pretty interesting, but they don't show us the visual example, which is kind of sad, but no worries, we'll worry about it later. Layering items with z-index. Grid items can occupy the same cell, and in this case we can use the z-index property to control the order in which overlapping items stack. Overlapping without z-index, if we return to our example with items positioned by line number, we can change this to make two items overlap. So in this example, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with box and box 1 to 5. And here, for example, they say box 1 and box 2 to the same grid cell. So they're using grid column start 1, grid column end 4, but this is the maximum. So here they're not adding it. Grid row start 1, and so they're slightly overlapping. As you can see, the 2 is slightly overlapping the 1. The item box 2 is now overlapping box 1. It displays on top as it comes later in the source order. So in the source order, as you can see, box 2 is after box 1, so it will overlap it without z-index. But as I can see, we can control the order. So controlling the order, we can control the order in which items stack up by using the z-index property. Just like positioned items, we give box 2 a lower z-index than box 1, and it will display below box 1 in the stack. So I guess that was already explained above, but yeah, pretty straightforward. We can give it a z-index and it will lay underneath box 1. We have next steps. Code examples in the next part of this guide, so on and so forth. So we're done with this MDN article, and lastly we have a video to watch that is very quick. Let's go through it.
Now in this lecture I'm going to go through all the terminology that's required in order to know what CSS grids are all about and to follow any explanations on the specification. Don't worry, it's not too much terminology, but it's just required in order to be able to really talk about CSS grids. So first of all, there are grid lines. A grid line can be either a horizontal line like here, or it can be a vertical line, therefore separating all the columns in the grid. So the grid lines are basically all the lines that you would end up drawing if you were to draw your grid on a piece of paper. And now with the grid lines defined, we can also define what a grid track is, because it's defined as the area between two grid lines. So effectively a grid track is going to be one or more rows or columns. So in this case here you can see that the grid track here is just a row in the grid. It might also be a column, it could also be two rows, but it's just the area between two grid lines. So similarly, this might also be a column here if we're talking about a vertical grid track. And so then next we also have grid cells, which are areas separated by 4 grid lines, and they are the smallest unit you have in a grid. So essentially it's just the same thing as you would normally refer to when you're talking about a grid cell. So the same thing as a grid cell in Excel, for instance. Now apart from the grid cell, there's also the more general grid area. So this is also part of the grid that's defined by 4 grid lines that surround it, and it can be used later on to arrange elements on the grid. So this is going to be a very powerful tool, and you can see this as a generalization of a grid cell, which is also a grid area, but the smallest grid area you can have, so just one cell. Now lastly, all we're going to have to talk about is a grid container and grid items. So the grid container is just going to be the whole grid that contains all the grid cells, and a grid item can be any element that you place inside the grid. Like for instance here we have one grid item that spans just one cell, and similarly you can also have grid items spanning multiple rows or columns, like here for instance spanning 2 columns. So it's going to be a very flexible tool to lay out your elements on the grid in whatever way you like. And now with this, you also already have all the terminology you need in order to understand any blog articles or anything I talk about in this course and anything that's related to CSS grids. So with this, we're now ready to dive into how to use CSS grids.
Perfect. Functional program. So this guy still makes videos 2 months ago. Alright, perfect. So this was the last resource here. Video on grid terminology, so we can mark this complete. Let's see what the next section is. Positioning grid items. Alright, so as you can see we have overlapping stuff from what we just read, and from the MDN article already I know a little bit about positioning grid items, but we're going to continue with this tomorrow because I don't have more time. But tomorrow I'll do my best to wake up early so we can do a morning stream before work and move on to this positioning grid elements. Hopefully we can start doing the project tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to that. And I must thank you all guys for being here, sticking with me, and I'm going to see you tomorrow. Thanks so much everyone, especially Supreme Overlord, my guy that's been tuned in the whole stream. Thank you guys, and until tomorrow, bye bye.